Hi.
Hello. In a couple of segments back, maybe 2 weeks ago, we talked about Job 14, Job 19. Classic proof texts for your view of life after death or not, if you're a Jehovah's Witness.
Right.
We wanted to look more closely, since we've just gone into the epistemology of Ecclesiastes, to now take that idea that, no, there's nuances here, and there's problems with inspiration in certain Bible books which become acute, and there's a peculiar version of that we might highlight using the book of Job as an illustration, maybe our best Bible illustration of the complications of inspiration. So we thought we'd look at the whole book in the next 2 segments, or 3, just using the book of Job as a kind of a test case of various ways of approaching or defining inspiration. For instance, in this segment we wanted to look more closely at the 3 conservative positions on inspiration.
Right. Starting
with what many consider to be the traditional view. The first view, the default position for many conservatives, that would tend to be called fundamentalists, is that the Bible is inspired in every word. And these type of people who look at the Bible notion of inspiration that way would tend to be the kind who would gravitate to the King James only arguments about the necessity of having a right translation, a loyal translation.
Because they'll make an issue of certain words being translated differently in different translations, or missing from a translation, a word that they're used to.
Yeah, and they'll be very bothered by verses that are omitted from newer translations that were in the King James.
Right.
So that's maybe the smaller of the 3 views in terms of the number of people who commit to it. It's very
millions,
sizable.
Right? Still
definitely millions. A larger group, and at least in my experience in the Western English-speaking world, would be the conservative position that every thought of the Bible is inspired, but not necessarily the choice of words, which, of course, will vary according to the translation you're using or the language that you're reading in your Bible from. That point of view tends to be more nuanced than the other one. That is, people who hold to that point of view about not verbal inspiration but idea inspiration or thought inspiration would tend to also see nuances and problems such as the ones we've already discussed in Ecclesiastes. They would tend to see that as an interpretive problem rather than an inspiration problem.
Okay.
And then there's a third group, which I think is the largest in the English-speaking world, which are the kind of conservatives or moderates who would see that God's providence or inspiration relates more to the entire collection that we call the Bible, the 66 books.
The choice of books.
Yeah.
As a whole.
Yeah.
Giving you what you need.
Yes, what you need to do the work of God in the world.
Okay.
And to live a Christian life. So they would tend to dwell more on the canonical place of each part of the Bible. What place does this play? What purpose does it serve within the canon?
Okay.
And then they would tend to see some entire books like Ecclesiastes and Job and even the book of Revelation as problematic to start with.
Right.
Because you could read them the wrong way.
So I'm thinking you're also talking about some books being more authoritative in a way than other books. Am I right? Like, when you're listening to a prophet, say, compared to you're listening to Job and his companions, you're gonna filter it a little differently.
Yeah.
Because of who it is speaking and the authority with which they speak.
Now we'll get to the application of this in the book of Job in a couple of minutes, but as to the whole Bible, the greater context of the Bible itself, they would tend to see what you just said, that you'd have to read apocalyptic differently than you would read the epistles of Paul.
Right.
And you'd have to somehow filter the words of Jesus through the epistles written by the apostles to get your correct understanding of how even the words of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount apply to now. Because there's a whole camp in the hundreds of millions of people who are committed to what we call the dispensational view of the Bible. They are of the mind, tend to be of the mind, that the Sermon on the Mount is impossibly idealistic. It has to be tempered by other parts of the Bible. Well, that's problematic for a lot of older traditions who say, no, everything's measured by the words of Jesus. So there's those kind of nuances even within the conservative
where do the
camp.
red letter people?
The red letter people, the people who tend to emphasize the words of Jesus in the Gospels, tend to be very wary about, they're wary of both liberals and dispensational point of view that tends to want the Sermon on the Mount to be future as opposed to now. These are subtleties I wouldn't have seen when I was a Jehovah's Witness among Christians who tend to be conservative.
Right.
Then, of course, there's the fourth camp. Those who view the Bible as inspired, maybe. These ones you'd tend to call liberals. They would tend to see inspired stuff within the Bible, but they wouldn't therefore take the term inspired and apply it to the entire Bible. They would view, as it were, the inspiration as limited for most of the Bible. They would tend to view it mostly as the words of men. Because
of the human element in it.
But they would go all the way from, yes, the Bible is the most inspired book, even if not all of its parts are inspired, right over to, well, the Bible's just a human document. So all of those would be shades. They'd all be shades of Category 4, what we would call liberalism.
Okay.
So then we want to take this.
Yeah, you were going to talk about the third category, the ones that view the whole, and kind of analyze that. I think a little more about like why the difference, like when people believed more the first two, and when people believed the third one, because there's been a shift.
There has been
history.
A shift. Yes, about 160 or so years ago, what we now call the higher criticism started to come over from Germany. And along with that shift, we saw a transition. In prior centuries, the first and second categories tended to dominate, the idea of verbal inspiration of Scripture, or at least idea inspiration, but a very conservative view. Then this third view that I think is now predominant was the creation of a microscopic application to the New Testament and the Old Testament. I would say, as a fruit of the criticism, thinking on the Bible had to get more sophisticated because of the criticism, negative criticism from one side, but also the tools that this new way of looking at the Bible provided for us, and not just so-called higher criticism, but archaeology, for instance.
Yeah, the discoveries that were made, the findings, even of the scrolls, I guess. Like all these things have made it possible to see the original language, to see discoveries of when things were, or peoples that existed, like just confirmation of things. So there's more scrutiny going on.
They filled in the historical backdrop of the Bible cultures, and that is valuable.
Yeah.
So for those who are deeply suspicious, and I think you were.
Yeah, I would say that when we first were doing this kind of discussion about the canon of the Bible, how it came to be, and higher criticism, I was like in panic mode. Even just the word criticism struck a bad chord with me, because I feared that to even look at any of this was to somehow demean God and the Bible. I didn't view it as I would now maybe compare it to something like medicine. There was a time when people didn't know about germs, and we couldn't look at cells and the discovery of DNA. All these medical advancements have been to our benefit. They've been a blessing. So putting the Bible under a microscope, just like they did cells under a microscope, is going to enhance. It's not going to take away. It's going to actually improve you. It's going to help you understand better.
So the word criticism is not...
It's not a dirty word.
It's not a negative term in itself. There is negative criticism, and there's also other types of criticism that are just simply looking at the data more closely, i.e. with a microscope.
Yeah, so like in universities or in high school, they do literary criticism. They're not saying, we don't like Shakespeare. Let's think of everything negative we can about Shakespeare.
No,
what they're doing is they're they're critiquing the actual works.
Well, they're bringing
They're
you,
looking closely
I would
at
say,
it.
they're bringing you closer to the text than you otherwise would have been. So,
Right.
so in that sense, all of these things grew together. The growth of archaeology, the higher criticism, so-called, the growth of higher education within the churches, that is seminaries, Bible schools, all of that developed within the last 200 years. And all of it can be used negatively,
Yeah.
but it depends upon your intent and your starting point, for one thing, and also why you're doing it.
Yeah.
So if you're doing it for the right reason, you'll end up, you're actually enhancing the gifts of well, application of the Bible is one thing, but also your method of understanding the Bible is enhanced by the new tools that I think God in His providence has given us in the last 200 years.
Even the word, I'm just thinking, even the word apologetics, I didn't understand what was meant by apology. Because to me that sounded like you were saying, I'm sorry, like this is something wrong with this.
What does it mean, really?
But it's defense.
Defensive.
So that was something I had to learn after leaving the witnesses. The other thing that was pointed out was with the witnesses, they actually use some of the tools, even though they're creating in us as witnesses this negative feeling about any of the means by which they got those tools.
Yeah.
They criticize it, and yet they use study Bibles, they use references.
8 book is full of them.
And they go to Christendom's tool bag and take out what will benefit you, and you use them. So we don't think of it in a negative framework then, because it's kind of been gift wrapped for us.
So I would say if you consider yourself one of the first 2 categories, that is conservative Christian who believes every word of the Bible, or every thought is inspired in the Bible with few nuances. If you're one of those first 2 categories, then you need to think about, if you have a study Bible, you in effect are using the same tools that number 3 and 4 do. You're using the tools of higher criticism.
You're being blessed by what they've done.
Yeah.
This scrutinizing, this criticism has actually blessed you.
So we'll talk more about that and the use of study Bibles and basically what you're depending on when you have these footnotes and textual issues at the bottom of your pages in any of these Bibles, including the Watchtowers.
Right.
You're actually leaning upon the understanding of the last 200 years in textual and higher criticism. But we want to take all of these principles now and apply them to the book of Job. And the complication in Job, unlike Ecclesiastes, is not the starting point, i.e., what does he claim? What does Koheleth claim about his own viewpoints? Where did they come from? In this book,
you've got 8 voices instead of 1. You start with God and Satan talking. Yeah.
So it gets complicated right away. In the first 2 chapters, the principal voices are God and the Satan. He's called that. It's not a proper name in Job. The Satan, the adversary.
Yeah.
And then in early chapters before the men come and sit by Job, we have briefly the voice of his wife. Then we have the 3 so-called comforters.
And you have Job commenting back and responding to both his wife and to his companions.
And then later in the book you have another character, a younger man called Elihu, steps in, and that makes a total, as far as I can see, of 8 voices. 6 human voices. Yeah. 2 non-human voices.
Right.
And some would even throw in a 9th voice, because they would remind, one of our comments has already reminded us that Eliphaz refers to a supernatural experience he had, and he actually quotes the voice of a spirit.
Right.
Yes, so there's at least 8 or 9 voices in this book, and that does complicate the issue of how do you view inspiration. So we'll deal with that more completely in the next segment.
Right. Okay.